Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone joining us. I'm Sarah Searle. I'm a senior manager at BEO Systems, and it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce and moderate this session on predicting retention and viral suppression in HIV programs. Today, we're going to hear from Lucien. Is it Devou? Is that how I pronounce your name?
That's a nice way of saying it. Thanks.
He's the director at Palindrome Data. Lucien is a creative data strategist who blends business and technology competencies to achieve results in the risk and marketing domains. After a decade in high-tech product development, he completed his MBA and joined LexisNexis Risk Solutions, a global data and analytics company in Atlanta, USA, where he ran the fast-growing digital economy sector. While there, he worked with Facebook, Amazon, Google, Uber, Airbnb, and other digital disruptors to help them better understand their consumers, grow their market share, assess risks, and mitigate threats. He went on to co-found Palindrome Data, a data analytics company building machine learning, predictive models, and tools to optimize treatment and personalized care in low-resource settings. I'm very excited for today's session, as most of my work at BAO is actually with PEPFAR. And in this session, Lucien will discuss how machine learning can be used to identify HIV patients at risk for defaulting on treatment and not being virally suppressed. Predictive modeling can be used to improve targeting of interventions through differentiated models of care, increasing cost effectiveness and improving patient outcomes, which we all know is part of reaching some of the aggressive goals we need for epidemic control for HIV. So with that, I will turn it over to Lucien. Please leave your questions throughout the session in either the Q&A pane or in the chat. And after he's finished presenting, we will have a Q&A session to answer those questions. Thanks, everyone, and over to you, Lucien.
Wow, thanks, Sarah. With that kind of introduction, I don't know if it's necessary for me to even show anything. That was great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, wherever you find yourself in the world. It's a real privilege to be able to present this work to you. It's been a labor of love for many years, and it's great to see where it's landed and the fruits of our labor, and I'm really excited to share that with you today. So let's see how we go. What I'd like to start off with is take you a little bit on a journey, from the inception of these ideas, and describe our approach to machine learning and risk scoring. And then I'll talk through a very specific case study that we've done. It's sort of our flagship research. And then we'll talk about some practical tools and actually get into user testing. So what these tools look like on the ground and the progress we're making there. So I look forward to getting as many questions as possible. I'll try to get through this as pretty quickly, and then we can have follow-ups later if that's okay. All right, so what might be helpful for some of you is to just compare Palindrome's approach to a traditional one. And Palindrome's approach is something we have again learned over the years as I was working in risk solutions in the US, working with these big digital economy companies. And we've basically borrowed and stolen all those techniques and ideas that have become quite readily available to most people. And we're just deploying them in these low resource settings and using them on these large public health data sets, which is pretty great. So in terms of predictors and what typically goes into these predictions, what traditionally happens is these things are pretty linear and univariate. Whether it's someone who's young is typically more risky. We sort of take a more complex, non-linear position. And so we combine a whole number of different attributes, which you'll hear me refer to as features. And so now we're getting very granular groups, such as youth who are unemployed, youth who are employed and get their visits scheduled after payday. You find that for whatever reason, young people, when they get paid, they don't typically show up for that appointment, and they're sort of a more high-risky group. The second thing is that most of the traditional way of looking at this is very fixed. It's very set on the first meet, so to speak, and those things don't change over time. Whereas our modeling really caters for a very dynamic relationship with the patient. So what you typically see is, someone comes in and they're actually pretty stable for a while, but at some point they start to show up late to appointments, and that's indicative of something. And you see people go from what we call green to yellow to red over time, and that's very fascinating way to look at modeling these risk patients. The last thing, again, is how we pair an intervention with a risky individual. And we have found that traditionally things are very blanketed. It's a very blunt sort of instrument, whether it's targeted at key populations. These interventions aren't very well tailored. And that's, again, where we think, we've created what I'll show you in a bit called these patient archetypes. And so for someone who's we call a lone ranger, they live quite far away and they live alone, you might have a different, more tailored intervention for that individual. And the models just allow us to gain access to the texture of those people. All right. Just to expound a little more on this, what's typically looked at are the patient information. It's often very limited to demographics and clinical data. Whereas, we look at the whole person, or at least we try to, and we try to get as much data and sort of augment data, access what's called alternative data. And this just allows us to have a much better view of the patient, a more holistic kind of concept. And these are just a few of the features we've modeled with before that have really allowed us to, get that better insight into what's going on in that patient's life and how these things change over time. And again, how that would be a predictor for something we're trying to model. So we kind of call this demographics, clinical data, psychosocial, and the behavioral patterns that we see taking place. But there's one other thing, which is this problem in time, which again speaks to the dynamism of the model and sort of making sure we are keeping track and updating this risk score, if you will, for an individual patient. All right, so next up, I'm going to talk about a case study. It was really done in order to understand the vital load at someone's next test, and then sort of anticipating when someone's going to become lost to follow-up, which we regarded as them being more than 28 days late or coming 28 days late after their next scheduled appointment. And so we were trying to predict those things. And it comes back to the 90-90-90, which I think Sarah actually referred to, these really important goals. And this is probably a little outdated, those percentages right now. But if you think about the vital load on the far right, it's really about how do we identify that 13% who are going to be vitally unsuppressed at their next test. And then again, for adherence and retention, how do we identify the 32%, which again is a pretty high number, who are going to be lost to follow-up at their next visit. So getting a little bit more into the specifics of this project, we had a pretty large data set from one of our implementing partners down in South Africa. And, they had 300,000 patients, 1 million lab results, and 14 million clinic visits. So it was a pretty substantial data set. And we were able to take that data set and engineer features, which is just a fancy way to say we kind of taken the data, the attributes, the individual variables, and then we create new features that are really just better suited for machine learning and some of the modeling techniques we use. And so we put all this good stuff, pull from all these different aspects of the patient, and we use that to train a model to predict some outcome. And so as I've mentioned, the outcomes or the targets that we've done on this project was that next vital load. Are you going to be suppressed or unsuppressed? And are you going to be lost to follow-up? And so for baseline, for just like what's the basic amount of predictive power we can get if we just limited those features to the age and gender ones, right? We want to see, look, if we just threw age and gender at this, what happens? And as you can see, 57% accuracy, it's only marginally better than random, but it was good to kind of see what the data says if we just had age and gender. Now, if we opened it up to those 130 features, we started to see much better accuracy. And for this vital load one, the accuracy was a little higher than that 73%, And what we do then is to find the most valuable features and limit it to 10 or 11, and that's how we get down to that 73%. So we feel that's quite exciting. These are really positive numbers. We feel that they can actually have a real impact on the ground if we are able to have those types of predictive power. So this is just a side-by-side of the model results for the nerds. Those things at the bottom are called ROC curves. What you're trying to do is kind of measure the area under the curve. That just shows how well the model is doing. And as you can see, we've got 73% accuracy for that viral load outcome and 66% accuracy for that loss to follow-up. Loss to follow-up just being a little bit more squishy. It's not as well defined as a suppressed viral load. And I think there's a lot more psychosocial things going on there that we probably just don't have the data on that's going to give us a better prediction. Nonetheless, we think these are great results. And as we like to position it to the partners is, how can you change your program if you can reliably predict a viral load for 3 out of 4 patients? Or how would you change your intervention strategy or your program design if you had 2 out of 3, you could reliably predict when they're going to be lost to follow-up? And we'll talk just a little bit more about some of the impact about what we can do now that we have a model that can stratify and segment the high risk from the low risk folks. So if you just take the standard loss to follow-up rate across the different time in care, so that first visit is naturally quite high. We've got this drop, and then all of a sudden folks start to show up a little bit more risky. They might become complacent, or there's all kinds of reasons for that. But what the machine learning, the modeling allows us to do is to sort of segment and stratify again out those very high folks from the medium and again those low risk folks. And you'll hear me say this probably a number of times out of during the presentation, but knowing who those low risk folks are, which the model is actually really, really good at, it just allows you to shift resources. So what we always, we're working in a low resource settings, and we stretch thin, resources are scarce, and it's really about how do you prioritize the right patient and how do you make sure you're using your resources most efficiently. And that's really the value proposition for the partners. This is just, again, another example. We keep hearing how young males are so much more risky, which they are. They're slightly more risky as a group, as a pretty big group. But again, once we start pulling out these different archetypes, if you will, you'll see that there's a prompt and loyal group that's actually quite big, and they are lower risk than the average. And then again, you really are able to identify those folks who have been coming late a couple times, or the ones that are going to multiple facilities. And of course, the returning defaulter and their loss to follow-up rates are just much, much higher. So when you layer in these psychosocial or behavioral information on top of your demographics, I think you really do start seeing these differentiated patients. Right. So the next sort of chapter in our story is on the tools that we've now created. So as you can see, the modeling is a sort of a research exercise. And now what we're trying to get are figuring out better ways that these very sophisticated tools can be used on the ground, and how can we make this usable. And we've done a bit of work there as well. I'm just going to show you 2 quick examples. I'll talk about a digital scorecard that runs in an app, and then I'll talk about this patient archetype concept, which I think is pretty neat. So as the digital scorecard goes, it runs in a mobile phone. We had tablets on sites that we had nurses use during some counseling. And the first thing is really just the basic demographics and things that you can actually pull from the patient's file. And of course, if you have this in your patient record system, you can integrate the model as just a little piece of software that's an algorithm that pulls some data in, and you can actually get your risk score from that, which is obviously my favorite way because it's automated and requires very little human intervention. But there are, these, little questionnaires, let's call them, that will allow you to just ask the patient sitting in front of you and talk through some of their story. The second part is a bit of psychosocial questions. and the output is basically a risk score. So with that risk score, this patient happens to be a low risk, you can maybe have them go for decanting or express pickups. But there's all kinds of ideas we have around the interventions here. For a high-risk patient, you might have intensive counseling or some other kind of intervention. And then the yellow groups, or the medium risk folks, I think those are the ones you really want to start shifting and helping them find ways to become green. And so there's always ideas for interventions at that stage as well. Archetypes are basically personas which, again, allow us to personalize care. And this is where some of that tailoring of very granular interventions can be seen. And so the first one we have are, again, I mentioned previously, these employed folks. They're younger, they get a visit scheduled after payday, they are 100% more likely to be lost to follow up at their next visit. So, perhaps letting them select their own appointment date is just a little nudge, a little intervention that can help them get back on track, and that's more accommodating to their life. The second one I did mention is the Lone Ranger. So this person lives alone, or maybe one other person, and travels quite a distance to the clinic. It takes quite a long time. And they are 50% more risky, but they would require a totally different type of intervention, which may be like a coach or a buddy or some carpool system that just makes their journey less tedious. Finally, we get to the most exciting bits, which is actually seeing these tools in action. So I'll talk a little bit about user testing and some of the things we've seen on the ground, what worked, what didn't work, but what the whole work, the whole labor of love was really about taking these machine learning models and then translating them and creating these paper-based scorecards or these digital apps. And we have a pretty good process to do that, and we kind of bumped our heads on quite a bit of things, and we feel like we've landed somewhere really exciting. So here's an example of 3 different types of scorecards. They range in complexity from a very simple checklist on your far left. These are actually forms that have been sort of filled in by clinicians on site. We spend quite a bit of time in sort of rural clinics, very, very low resource settings. But the practitioners really just took to this, and they found it quite empowering. And I've got a couple anecdotes and stories, but what was really great to see was how they could use this to have a better conversation with their patient. And it sort of empowered them to take the next step and assign an intervention or have a conversation with them that could lead to a better outcome. And that's always the idea. The reason why I wanted to show you this one, though, is that scorecard on the right. The arithmetic behind it was just too complex, and it sort of turned out to be not a good idea. Though what I will say is a lot of the psychosocial information was so key that we created a simpler version. Actually, I think I have some examples. Yep. So these are simpler, arithmetically simpler questionnaires, but they sort of still have those questions at the bottom, which we refer to as psychosocial. And while these forms are now a little longer, what we did validate was that they really wanted the psychosocial questions because they intuitively knew it had a pretty significant impact on someone's risk, and it really allowed them to, again, have a more rich conversation with the patient in front of them. So while it did add a couple more questions, it was kind of so interesting to find out, no, they want more questions because it just gives them a better way to assess that patient. All right, so just summary findings, some of the things we learned. We had 6 objectives, I believe. The first one was about feasibility. So can these work? And 95% of the tools were completed and classified as easy to use. So each time you filled in a question, you had to say, was this questionnaire hard? Was it hard to find the information? And was it easy to use? And then the second question was sort of whether they agreed with the risk score. So they'd land on a yellow patient or a red patient or a green patient, and the question basically said, look, how aligned was this to your intuition? And it was pretty well aligned. So most people agreed with the score. We're kind of looking for, wait, is there some cognitive dissonance going on here? But it seemed like, it lined up pretty well. For those 10%, who didn't agree, it was very interesting because folks would say things like, oh no, but I know them and I know their mom and I know that there's this thing going on in their life. And so it's just different to what the scorecard says. And that's just a function, again, of the score, these modeling not incorporating enough types of data, because we don't have that information, of course, when we're modeling. So that's that agreeability concept. And then the third one, which obviously the numbers are all wrong, are really about, what were the aspects of the tools that were important. And I've already mentioned the psychosocial information was pretty valuable. And there was a slight preference for the digital tool. You don't have to calculate any numbers and add things up. So that's certainly, where feasible, a really good idea. Sorry, there was one thing where every patient has a file, and the file has sort of a A4 page with columns for each visit. And what was specifically requested, which was great to hear, their feedback was, can I just get a red, a yellow, and a green sticker so that I can track the patient's risk over time, which again, it's the kind of thing that I would never be able to think of, but it was really insightful in terms of, matching their practical life with this risk score. The last three things we checked was was the tool easy to train? Can people train on it? Which we found evidence for, and then how useful the tool was. And the best anecdote I have here is that after the user testing, we kind of got all the pieces of paper and the tablets, and we had multiple requests to actually, leave the tablets there, which we did for some folks, and replenish the paper scorecards, which was just, again, very encouraging for us to see that this is legit and people really do want to use these types of tools. It is helping and it's useful. And then as far as where in sort of the patient journey this should be, we haven't quite nailed that down just yet. There's all kinds of ideas, but certainly the nurses and the adherence counselors who we worked with would be sensible end users for these patient visits. So what's next for our journey and the process? Mostly we looking to replicate the HIV model regionally. So we've kind of got some process, some way to do this, and we can now start churning out different geographies. And we've got a few projects that have already started in a few different countries other than South Africa. We've also got a couple projects lined up that's going to allow us to use these very same techniques and approaches in other programs, ANC and PPFP, and we're always looking for other opportunities where we can just kind of create evidence and build, a product or showcase these techniques that can be used in other diseases. And then lastly, maybe not now, but at some point, we think that this is so affordable and so game-changing, and it can have so much impact that we do want to get to the stage where we're starting to operationalize and creating some real products at scale. Lots more user testing to go and lots more refinements, of course, but kind of part of the exciting journey. So that's sort of all I had as far as the presentation goes, and I would love to dive deeper in any bits that are interesting, but I'll hand it back to Sarah. Maybe are there any questions?
We have some questions coming in. Thank you so much for that really fascinating presentation. I selfishly have a lot of questions also, but we'll get to the ones in the Q&A right now. So the first one we had said, they're noting that it's striking that this type of modeling or predictive analysis requires patient-level data, individual-level data generally, and they're wondering if this type of data is generally available to you in low and middle income settings. Is it hard to obtain? What does that look like?
I would say yes and no. The data is abundant. anybody who's running a clinic, or I mean, at this stage, the maturity of data collection, monitoring, and evaluation is so, the timing wouldn't have been right for us to start this company 10 years ago. But at the moment, that really isn't the problem. Now, the problem is, of course, that we handle this data with great care. There's privacy, things that are always evident. Fortunately, we never need to take what's called PII, or personally identifiable information. I mean, your name has no correlation with whether you're going to be lost to follow-up or not. And so there's a lot of just sanitizing that the implementing partners do before we refuse to take anything that's sort of sensitive on the sort of identifiable nature. But no, I would say that most people have the data. They just don't know quite what to do with it. They're used to making charts and indicators, which are all great, but I think they're missing the real opportunity, which is to have that impact on the ground and to have it make data-driven decisions with the patient sitting in front of you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I do think frequently in these types of low and middle income settings, we tend to think that there isn't that data available to us. So it's heartening to hear that it is.
Yes.
Along the terms of the types of data that you're using, we have a question. What types of data do you anticipate are needed to better understand loss to follow-up amongst other health programs that you are currently exploring?
Yeah, I'm going to stick to HIV if that's okay, but because I just know this quite well. But loss to follow-up, again, it's not in your clinical folder necessarily. It's kind of like what's going on with your job and what's going on with your spouse and your family. There's all these other things that are really, so I think we believe that psychosocial information is pretty key. Now, I will distinguish that from what we would call self-attested data. So self-attested data is anything you'd find in a survey. They kind of tell you some story. We find that data is much less predictive than sort of an operational data set. So operational being like just routine data that gets collected in the clinics. And then, my business partner said not to mention this, but I'll be a little bit controversial. If you just gave me like some data that's on the person's phone, maybe, I mean, if you're talking about limited data access, but I could probably tell you quite a lot about what's going on in their lives and their riskiness. And, and again, coming from the financial services sector, this is something that's, normalized, or at least, we can sell you a Coke very well by tracking and understanding your web presence. But somehow, obviously, for all the right reasons, healthcare is slow to adopt those kinds of things where it can really, really benefit the patient. But I'd say the alternative stuff like telco data, utilities, I think those things could really move the needle in terms of predictive data sources.
Yeah, no, we like controversy. That's that's interesting. You just need an app on the App Store where they click to terms of service, and then you'll have it.
I mean, yeah, and one idea we've been playing with is to literally have patients manage their risk. So there's a way where you can gamify this, where they sort of have a mechanism. It's a WhatsApp little chatbot that's helping you to do better, and you can get a lot of interesting information there, but really some good coaching. And I think when you have a relationship with a patient, you can get access to a lot more data, obviously.
Sure. I think continuing along to sort of the natural next question, we have this data, we have this predictive ability. There's a great question. Have you looked at the impact of these techniques on clinical outcomes or on improving cost efficiencies? So once we're able to identify kind of these, triage levels of risk, have we followed clients to see what happens?
It is the only thing that matters. And we are at the stage where we are doing those kinds of tests, but we are a long way off, I think, from being able to say with any credibility or certainty to what degree this works. Because again, if it improves things by 2%, less interested, but the number we have is 20%, and we think that this can really change the game. And the one thing that's going to take a lot more work as well is the intervention design. So you can tell, I mean, knowing who's at risk does nothing. Now we've got to figure out, while that patient's still in front of me, I know that with some degree of certainty, in 2 or 3 months, they're going to be lost to follow-up. What kind of intervention can I design now that I have them here with me? I think it's completely different to the way folks have been thinking about it, which is, oh, they lost to follow-up, now we're reactive. We've got to get real creative about designing proactive interventions. And I think that's going to have the most impact and effect, because again, you have them in front of you, you're not having to track them down or whatever.
I think that gets to a couple of the other questions we have as well, which is that this really is something I really value about this presentation, is that, in a lot of work on HIV thus far, as much as we strive to segment the population into risk factors, whether it's key populations, men who have sex with men, injecting drug users, et cetera, as much as we try to do that, each of those groups is not a monolith, right? And so what I love about what you're showing here is that within each of these groups, there are different levels of risk, right? And that's really, like you're saying, it gets down to the patient in front of you, which is frankly kind of different than the way public health looks at things, right? We're thinking about populations. So I love this question in the chat that says, what level of effort, or, my question is really, what would it look like to implement this on a large scale in an HIV program? It sounds like you've done the feasibility work here and you've implemented in a number of clinics, but is this something that you could see rolling out with that intervention design on a large scale? What would that look like? And that person is asking, for example, trainings, tool developments, et cetera.
Absolutely. Before I can even answer that, I have to just say again, everybody says, and I'm using the extreme, the young men are terrible, whatever, they're so risky. And you know what? I can find you half of those young men that are going to be less risky than your elderly females or something. So, it's really in the detail. Okay, I'll stop. But coming back to the original question, which was something like, how do we see this in operating at scale? Yeah, I think, having seen this play out, for example, with Amazon or with credit lending fintech companies in the US, I think there's a number of different ways. What we don't want to be limited by is the systems and technologies. So we've always said our work is agnostic. You can run this on your current system. We just have something that kind of pulls through an API the data and then spits back a risk score or sort of some what we call warning flags or codes that will help be able to make a decision. And we also see this going again in terms of like these paper-based forms. We actually think that could be incorporated into a normal visit consultation. So I think we're not limited necessarily by anything at the moment, except like the willingness to and the appetite to kind of have folks try this out. We've got the technology, we've got the a couple tools. Now we're going to find out all kinds of things that we haven't thought of about those tools and things that need to be incorporated. But being system agnostic and technology agnostic, we think that's going to really allow this to take off, if that makes sense. I feel like there was a little bit of a weak answer. I don't know if that covered all the things. There's 101 other operational nightmares and things that we're still going to run into. But we're excited to try it.
Yeah, sounds like it. A very concrete question here, but actually I was curious about this too. What tools were used for this analysis? I assume they mean sort of what suite of data science tools were you utilizing?
Sure. We've been using Python, and the data science community in Python is incredible. And the one thing I cannot be more adamant about is that the modeling is the easy bit. Like the machine learning, it all sounds fancy, gradient boosting, all these things. Google's done it for us, and they've made the libraries of this community has just done an incredible job of providing the techniques and the tools. So I think most get that. It's all around it. They're getting the data into the right format and feature engineering, which is again, something that, I think takes a bit more experience, but everything we've done was in Python. We do explore other, maybe more automated tools to help us with the data pipeline, but for the most part, the modeling was all done in Python.
For that. We do have a question from Patricia, which I think is very important, but I'm not sure if it, well, you can tell me. It says, with the effects of COVID on livelihoods generally, whether it's lockdowns or what have you, was the model as predictable as it was before to predict loss to follow-up? I don't know if you were implementing during the pandemic, but...
We were not. We were testing a little bit in the clinics when things got better in South Africa, at least. But what I'd say to that is any model is going to, what's the right word, sort of lose predictive power. And what, again, in banking, you rebuild your credit score once a year. FICO builds their score every couple of years and they put out a new version. So I think COVID aside, these things are always going to need to be freshened and, just redone. It's not a very difficult process, but it needs to just have, the latest data, and that will just help you because things change, not significantly, and we haven't found that the model kind of degrades very quickly. We've done this over time. We've done this in different geographies and found that it's pretty robust, but that's also a function of this humongous data set that we were able to get access to.
And that was actually going to be my question, just in terms of, I didn't know if the data that you used for the modeling was specific to where you were working, or if you were just pulling from a global data set for that modeling. Where did the data come from? And are you still building it?
So the data set is from a implementing partner here in South Africa. And so we just get some de-identified version, and then we start our process of cleaning and engineering. So it was a local partner.
Really cool. And I know
and we do have some projects in a few other countries where we kind of replicating the techniques, but those have only just started.
And I do appreciate the question, Patricia, because I know we're all kind of waiting with bated breath to see what the effects are of COVID lockdowns, particularly with variants emerging in South Africa and elsewhere on the continent. So yeah, we'll, hopefully in the future, these types of models and predictive analyses can incorporate that type of thing. So yeah, thank you. Okay, any other questions in the chat? Let me check. I think we've gotten through all of them. Oh, Nicola, I missed a comment from Nicola saying she agrees with you on sort of the psychosocial determinants of care, and that so many of these metrics assume that people can prioritize their health. So they really are not a monolith, all of these young men. Okay, great. I think that is all that I have. This has been a fascinating conversation, Lucien, and my mind is certainly spinning with ways that I hope we can incorporate it in our work elsewhere. Thank you so much for sharing. I know in this virtual space, we can't always hear everyone's applause or appreciation, but I assure you that folks here are sharing that with you. And we've really appreciated the time that you've taken with us today.
Well, I really appreciate it, and it really was a privilege. As you can see, it's quite exciting for me. And of course, if anybody would like to hear more, and we've got some papers published with a lot more detail, reach out to the details on screen or find me on LinkedIn or whatever.
Sure. And for folks here, we are ending a bit early, but once all of these breakout sessions are finished, there's a 15-minute break, and then we're going to be having a fireside chat that will begin on the main stage. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you in other sessions. And thanks again, Lucien, for this really illuminating conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody.